Hi, it's December 18th, 2007. Welcome back. This is Rob Bryanton from the Imagining the 10th Dimension video blog. And in honor of the holiday season, I thought today's entry should be something a little more befitting these times. So it's called The End of the World, Death, and the 10th Dimension. And before we get into the text part, I just wanted to start with a song. This is one of the 26 songs from the book Imagining the 10th Dimension. This one's called The End of the World.
The end of the world, oft predicted, never realized. The end of the world, never hear it's such a surprise. How could billions be so wrong? The end of the world, the end of the world has already been, it's come and gone. Looking back through history, we often encounter prophecies of end times so very, very near. Next year, 5 years, 10 from now, a state of flux, some way, somehow. The process of postponement never clear. The end of the world, are predicted, never realized. The end of the world, never hear it's such a surprise. How could millions be so wrong? The end of the world, the end of the world has already been, it's come and gone. With space and time a continuum of everything there is to come, and might have been in one infinite ball. Multiple timelines now I see, apocalyptic destinies, prophets proving prophets after all. The saucers already landed, our star bodies already attained. Y2K, the global pandemic, huge disasters, the big freaking asteroid destroyed the world. The end of the world, oft predicted, never realized. The end of the world, never hear it's such a surprise. How could millions be so wrong? The end of the world, the end of the world has already been, it's come and gone. The end of the world has come and gone.
20 years ago, I was writing the music for a play about the end of the world. Placed 20,000 years in the future, it was probably ahead of its time. Its premise was that our ongoing environmental abuses had destroyed all plant and animal life and made our planet so unstable that the last remaining inhabitants were being forced to leave the Earth forever. Let's think back to 20 years ago. The 80s, quite frankly, were not a real great decade for environmental consciousness. The Me decade, as it's sometimes called, was looking back at the horrific environmental warnings of the 60s and 70s and saying, "Look, nothing happened, we're all fine, relax." This got me thinking that no matter what time in history you're looking at, there's always been a small contingent waving their arms and saying, "The end is nigh." In the 80s, trying to get the audience to imagine that the end was coming as a result of our pollution of the environment seemed to me to have some difficulties. But eventually, I reasoned, there's going to have to be a time when one of those end-of-the-world predictions come true, whether that be tomorrow or 20,000 years from now. Was there a way, I wondered, to make those predictions seem more real to the audience right now? I should mention here that, as I describe in my book, I'd been pondering the ideas of branching timelines and important cusps that each of us experience as far back as the age of 7, and a wonderfully subversive book by Madeleine L'Engle called A Wrinkle in Time that I read a number of times as a child definitely had already caused these ideas to have started brewing years before. I should also mention here that I was really worrying about things that were none of my business. I was the composer, and the playwright creating the text for this project had already come up with a story rich in metaphor and texture, but there was still something about the environmental catastrophe angle that, for me, seemed to need a little bit more help, so I kept thinking. This is when the way of imagining reality that became the 10th Dimension project first occurred to me. The first 3 dimensions are easy. Think of a line. That's the first dimension. Draw a second line that crosses the first. That's the second dimension. Bend those lines and you're in the 3rd dimension. I was reading an article about quantum physics and trying to imagine how our reality could be so strange. Down at the quantum level, everything is a wave until it's observed, at which point its wave function is collapsed into one state or another. How, I asked myself, can the act of observation be what causes subatomic particles to stop being waves? It was just too weird. The way I decided to explain it to myself then was that this must mean that those waves exist in the 5th dimension and that it is us moving down our 4D line of time, picking one part of the waveform out from the other, that gives us the quantum observer effect. But what, I asked myself, if this was also happening not just at the quantum level, but also within our physical reality of space-time? If we think of our timeline as being in the 4th dimension, then that would mean that there are other parts of the 5th dimension where end-of-the-world predictions had already come true, and that if you wanted to get to those other timelines, you would have to jump through the 6th dimension to get there. I remember sitting in a coffee shop with the playwright, excitedly drawing little diagrams of lines and branches on a napkin and showing how you could fold the napkin to jump from one reality to another. This, I said to him, is how you can explain how the end of the world is constantly coming. Because if it had already come, we wouldn't be around anymore to ask why those end of the world predictions never seem to come true. This would mean, I reasoned, that at the end of the play, the characters were waiting to be rescued by someone from one of those other realities where the end of the world hadn't happened yet. Someplace out there in the 5th or 6th dimension. And the clincher for me was that once we got to the 7th dimension, that was as far as I could imagine, and the fact that so many spiritual and mystical systems also assigned a special significance to the number 7 seemed to add to the impact of what I was imagining. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I may not have explained these ideas back then as well as I could have, but the upshot is that the playwright looked at me like I was crazy, and the conversation was dropped. So, 20 years ago, I was a guy with an unusual idea about a way to imagine how our reality is constructed out in the middle of the Canadian prairies, and that was where the idea and I stayed. Over the following 2 decades, I showed these concepts to a number of other people, trying to get them interested in working on projects that explored these ideas. Some people seemed to get what I was talking about, but there were also quite a number who gave me that "you're crazy" look. Still, for me, the idea never went away, and about 5 years ago, I decided to write some songs about the ramifications of all this. Let's just say my obsession was still strong because in my spare time I ended up writing over 40 songs in about 2 months surrounding the ideas that sprang to me from this way of imagining reality. In the back of my mind, I was planning that someday these songs would end up on a CD with a little booklet explaining the ideas. As it turns out, that CD project ended up flipped on its head because I ended up with a 220-page book about these ideas, and the lyrics to 26 of the songs I wrote back then are printed at the end of the book. Okay, so let's move on from the cheery topic of the end of the world to talk about death. And here again is one of the 26 songs from this project about different ramifications of these ways of thinking about reality. This song is called "Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep."